We're about to begin a brand new love journey. Please comment on where you're watching from so we can see that our Soul Stories family is all around the world. The March rain poured over Boston as if the sky itself wanted to wash something away. It drummed relentlessly against the glass roof of the building where the law office sat on the seventh floor, where all endings seemed to unfold in silence. Clara sat there, in that cold room smelling of wood and paper, across from the man who had once been her entire world. Between them lay the divorce papers, thin as a file, heavy as a lifetime. David didn't look at her. He focused on the gold-plated pen in his hand, his index finger tapping against the desk in a slow rhythm, as though he were signing a contract with fate itself. Clara's eyes lingered on the ring on her finger, the one that had once symbolized forever, now nothing more than a meaningless circle of metal. Outside, the rain wouldn't stop. Droplets streaked down the glass, dragging their reflected faces into distorted shapes before they disappeared. "Are you ready?" the lawyer asked, his voice deep, even emotionless. David nodded, not a word. He leaned forward and signed, each stroke sharp and final. The man who had once kissed her at the altar now signed her away as if completing a business transaction. When he placed the pen down, Clara felt her heart being set down with it, heavy, cold, no longer beating to its old rhythm. "Mrs. Bennett," the lawyer called. She flinched slightly. In a few more minutes, well, that name would no longer belong to her. She picked up the pen. Her hand trembled. Her eyes stayed steady, but inside her, memories rushed back the mornings he made coffee, the hurried hugs at the door, his husky voice in the dark, the nights they had dreamed of a child. She signed. The handwriting tilted rightward, as if still trying to lean on something, even if it was nothing. When the last letter was done, a dense silence fell. David rose, pushing his chair back quietly, as if afraid of breaking the air. He didn't say goodbye. He only glanced at her for a heartbeat, an exhausted look, half regret, half pride, and then walked out. The door clicked shut. The sound was soft, yet it cracked like a breaking heart. She stayed still. The rain kept falling. The silence in the room turned cruel. They say calm follows every storm, but Clara knew some storms leave nothing behind but wreckage. She gathered her purse, her fingers brushing something in the inner pocket, the pregnancy test. She had taken it that morning in the cramped bathroom of her old apartment. 2 lines, 2 fragile pink lines trembling under the yellow light. She remembered the moment, her heart racing, hands shaking, no words coming out. She had once dreamed of this, a small life with David's eyes and her smile. But the dream had come too late. She opened the trash bin in the corner and looked down at those fading pink lines on white plastic, then quietly tore the test in half and dropped it in. The soft rip of plastic sounded like a farewell. "I'm sorry, my love," she whispered, her voice breaking, even though there was no one there to hear. When Clara stepped into the hallway, her footsteps echoed like someone else was walking in her place. The receptionist offered a sympathetic smile, the practiced kind worn by people who had witnessed hundreds of similar endings. The elevator carried her down to the lobby. Outside, the rain roared like waves. She stepped out, clutching her bag to her chest. No umbrella. The rain slapped her face, icy and relentless, but she didn't turn away. The cold felt honest. It reminded her she was still alive. Cars passed, people hurried by with heads bowed and coats pulled tight. Only she stood still at the curb, watching the water flow along the gutter, carrying scraps of paper, cigarette ends, and a fallen ring from someone's hand. She wondered, if I dropped mine, would it drift away that easily too? She took off her ring, holding it in her palm. It was cold like metal in a morgue. Then she closed her fingers around it, refusing to let go. Not because she wanted to keep David, but because she wasn't yet brave enough to discard the life she had lived. Her steps were slow as she crossed the street. Rain ran down her shoulders, soaking her hair and coat. Boston blurred behind a curtain of gray, like an old painting left too long in the rain. With every step, she felt older. From this day forward, she was no longer someone's wife. No longer had a home to go back to. No longer they. Only and inside her, a heartbeat, unaware it had already been left behind in silence. By the time she reached the train station, the last train to Vermont had just arrived. The screech of metal on tracks cut through the air, long and aching, like a wound refusing to close. Clara looked up at the flickering departure board. Departure, 6:40 p.m. She drew a deep breath, and in that instant realized she was standing at the border between what had died and what was still breathing. She boarded, taking a seat by the window. As the train pulled away, Boston receded behind her, but the rain kept chasing, as if unwilling to let go. Clara leaned her forehead against the glass. Through the sound of rain, she whispered a farewell that needed no answer. "Goodbye, David." Outside, the sky remained heavy with clouds, but somewhere within the gray, a small light flickered, faint, fragile, yet real. Clara didn't know what awaited her the next day, only that the rain would stop eventually, and when it did, perhaps she would learn to stand again, even with a wounded heart. When the train stopped at Maple Hollow, the Vermont sky hung heavy with fog. The small town lay tucked between rolling hills, so still that one could almost hear the snow melting. Here, everyone knew each other's names, but no one asked too many questions. Clara stepped off the platform and took a deep breath. The cold air cut against her skin like a blade, but at least it was real. The house she rented stood at the end of a dirt road, near the edge of a maple forest. An old wooden cabin with a dark shingled roof, crooked window frames, and a moss-covered porch. When she pushed open the door, the scent of damp wood and old paint rushed out, but the light streaming through the thin white curtains softened it all. It wasn't elegant, nor perfect, but it had something she had lost for too long, a silence. That first night, she sat on the floor, eating bread and cheese she had bought at the station. The old clock ticked in the corner, and the wind slipped through the cracks in the door, carrying the smell of pine. Clara looked out at the forest, thick and dark like a blanket over the world, and realized silence had weight. Heavy, yes, but it no longer frightened her. April drifted by in long, gray rains. She began working as a freelance designer again, setting up a desk by the window so that every morning she woke to the misty outline of trees. Some of her old clients from Boston still sent projects her way, but Clara worked slower now and more carefully. No one rushed her anymore. No more calls at midnight. No more emails marked urgent. No more of David's endless, "I'm busy." At night, when it rained, she played old jazz records. Chet Baker's trumpet wandered through the air like smoke. Clara would rest her hand over her stomach and whisper, "We'll be all right. It might not be perfect, but I promise you'll be loved in the truest way I know." Margot, her best friend, was her only thread to the old world. Every month, Margot drove 3 hours from Boston, bringing apple pie, newspapers, and her bright, easy laughter. "You can forgive him or not," Margot said one evening as they sipped tea by the fire, "but don't keep punishing yourself. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about moving on." Clara smiled faintly, eyes drifting to the frost-glazed window. "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm just learning how to exist without him." Margot said nothing. Some answers only those who have loved to the very end can understand. Summer came, filling the Vermont woods with the scent of grass. Clara's belly grew rounder, her shirts no longer buttoned. She began to draw again, illustrations in muted tones. Forest greens, rain grays, the pale gold of evening sun. In one drawing, she sketched a small branch growing out of a cliff, clinging on, surviving. One September morning, as she cleaned the window, she noticed ivy vines crawling up the wooden fence, deep green, unyielding, climbing higher despite the wind and rain. "Ivy," she whispered, tasting the word. "If it's a girl, I'll name her Ivy." From that day, she called the baby by that name. Ivy, a prayer wrapped in syllables, resilient, enduring, alive no matter how harsh the world became. Autumn passed, scattering golden leaves across the ground. By November, frost crept in through the mornings. Margot called, her voice full of concern. "Are you all right out there?" "I'm fine," Clara said, looking at the fog-covered garden. "I've gotten used to the quiet." However, the truth was that she was still afraid. Afraid of long nights. Afraid of the wind scraping against the roof, making her think someone was knocking. Afraid of giving birth alone. Yet buried beneath that fear was something else. Small, fragile, but real. Faith. On the last night of December, Vermont was buried in snow. The first pain came suddenly, like a knife twisting through her belly. She tried calling Margot, but the signal was weak. She tried the clinic, no answer. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks, snow pelting against the glass. Clara spread a blanket near the fireplace, bent forward, gasping. The contractions came and went, like waves. Sweat drenched her forehead. With every passing second, she felt herself breaking apart between pain and fear. And then amid the shattering silence, a sound, a cry, thin, trembling, but alive. Clara broke into tears. She didn't know if she was crying from pain or joy. She lifted the tiny body into her arms, wrapped it in a wool shawl, and pressed it against her chest. The baby's breath warmed her skin. Outside, the snow still fell, but inside the cabin, the firelight glowed against the child's cheeks, turning them gold. Clara looked down at the face with green eyes opening wide, unblinking, staring right into hers as if asking, "Who are you?" Clara trembled and smiled. "It's just you and me, sweetheart," she whispered, "and that's enough." The next morning, Margot arrived. Snow covered the roof. The wind still whistled through the trees. She stopped at the doorway. Clara sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, holding the sleeping infant. The fire still burned, casting warm light across her face. "Oh my God, Clara!" Margot gasped, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You did it!" Clara looked up, voice hoarse but calm. "No, I just survived. But maybe that's enough." By afternoon, the snow had stopped. Sunlight spilled over the ice outside the porch, scattering in 1,000 reflections like broken mirrors turned to light. Inside the wooden house, the baby's breathing mingled with the mother's heartbeat. A new beginning, quiet, fragile, but real. And for the first time in months, Clara felt something stirring inside her again. Something that almost felt like hope. 5 winters had passed since that night when snow buried the roof of a small wooden house in Vermont. The night Clara held her newborn daughter in her arms and swore she'd never let anyone hurt her. Now that house looked different. Time had softened everything. The porch wood had darkened, the fence was covered with moss, and inside, the walls were lined with paintings made by mother and daughter. In the garden, pale lavender swayed gently in the wind. Little Ivy, 5 years old, ran in circles, her white dress fluttering, small feet stamping the wet grass. Her brown hair caught the sunlight, and her green eyes mirrored the wide spring sky. Clara stood on the porch, coffee in hand, smiling as she watched her. In every movement of Ivy, she saw a part of herself, but stronger, freer. Life wasn't easy, but it was enough. She worked as a freelance illustrator for magazines and small publishing houses. The job allowed her to stay close to her daughter, and each project she submitted felt like a small victory because no one knew the artist behind those drawings was a single mother living deep in the mountains. Sometimes when night fell and the town went quiet, Clara thought of David, not because she still loved him, but because she once did. The memory of him was like a scar, not painful, but always there. She sometimes wondered if she had told him about the baby, would things have been different? Then she would stop herself, because Clara had learned one thing. Some stories are meant to stay buried because digging them up only makes you forget how you managed to keep living without them. Elsewhere, 300 miles away, David Rowe sat in the top floor office of Rowe Developments, overlooking the heart of Boston. The glass walls reflected the city, a forest of concrete and light. He wore a black suit, a perfectly knotted tie, his handsome face as unreadable as stone. 5 years had passed. David had turned his company into a real estate empire. Contracts poured in. Newspapers called him the man who touched Boston's sky. He had everything: wealth, fame, power, everything except peace. Between meetings, cocktail parties, and endless praise, David felt a constant emptiness, like the echo of a song that had been cut short. He lived exactly the way the world expected him to. Perfect, confident, untouchable. But when night came and the city slept, he couldn't. He had tried to love again. He dated beautiful, successful women with perfect hair, flawless smiles, and conversations that meant nothing to him. They all fit the image of the woman beside CEO Rowe. But none made him want to stay after dinner. None made him laugh without effort. He lived like a building without windows, solid, proud, and hollow. One night he had a dream about a child's laughter, a bright, ringing laugh that echoed through the locked corridors of his memory. When he woke, his heart was pounding. and he didn't know whose laugh it was. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe it was something he'd lost long ago but had never faced. Friday evening. The meeting dragged on until dark. When the last employee left, David remained in the office. The city lights spilled across the glass, carving fractured lines on the floor. He poured himself a glass of scotch but didn't drink. On his desk lay a thick folder, a new development project in Vermont. Just another small town named Maple Hollow. He was about to sign it without reading, but the name made him pause. Maple Hollow. Something inside him stirred, faintly like the sound of a string being plucked. He opened his laptop and searched. Images appeared. Fields of grass, wooden houses, rows of maple trees. He stopped at one photograph. A dirt road after the rain, a wooden fence, a dark-roofed house in the distance. For some reason, it felt familiar. He closed the laptop, leaned back, exhaled slowly. Years had passed since he'd tried to forget Clara. But perhaps the name of that town or the way rain hit the glass had woken everything again. They had once loved each other, not with noise or drama, but with the quiet certainty of two people building something together. A morning coffee, a shared song, the time he fixed her broken chair, the way she held his hand in a crowded street. He remembered her laugh, soft, kind, warm enough to make him believe life could be gentle. They had once been everything to each other, until ambition called his name. The first project, the first praise, the first number that proved he was someone. He thought if he worked hard enough, he'd bring her everything she deserved. Clara once said, "I don't need you to bring me the world, David. I just need you to come home." But he didn't understand. He thought when he succeeded, she would understand his absence. He thought he'd return to her after proving he was worthy. He believed time would wait. That love would be strong enough to endure loneliness. But Clara didn't need a man who conquered the world. She needed someone to have dinner with, to listen to the rain, to share silence without feeling alone. And David, running endlessly forward, never saw it until everything was gone. Now he had everything he'd once promised her: money, power, an apartment overlooking the Charles River. And yet every night, sitting in the glow of success, he felt something missing. The sound of her laughter, the smell of morning coffee, the way she called him to the table. The things he thought were small were actually his entire life. Clara was probably alive. Maybe she had remarried. Maybe she had forgotten him. But the thought made his chest tighten, not out of jealousy, but because he realized he'd never truly said, "I'm sorry." David once believed that time was a form of medicine, but after 5 years, he wasn't healed, only better at hiding the wound. He stood, opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he rarely touched. Inside was a small wooden box, dusted over. He opened it. Their wedding photo lay inside, showing two young people smiling in sunlight, their eyes locked as if the world had disappeared. She wore a simple white dress. He held her hand tight. David sat there for a long time, staring. City lights flickered against his face, reflecting in eyes that once held someone, but now only reflected emptiness. He didn't know how long he looked before closing the box, chest tightening until he had to breathe deeply just to steady himself. The wooden lid clicked shut, a sound dry and final, like the closing of a coffin. Outside, Boston gleamed with light. Inside, David Rowe sat motionless, one hand covering his eyes, the other gripping the edge of the desk. If anyone had seen him, they wouldn't have recognized the most successful man in the city. They would have seen only a man learning to face the one thing he could never rebuild with money. A memory that had died. And in Vermont, inside a small house scented with lavender, Clara was reading a story to Ivy. And the little girl realized she didn't need a castle to be happy, just a home where someone loved her. Ivy looked up, her green eyes sparkling. "Mommy, that's our house, isn't it?" Clara smiled softly, kissed her daughter's forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, it's our home." Outside, the wind brushed through the lavender fields, a quiet world, far from glass towers and the noise of restless souls. A world David Rowe had lost. And one day, though he didn't know it yet, it would be the place where he'd finally find himself again. Autumn in Vermont carried a kind of light Boston never had, soft, golden, tinged with quiet sorrow. The hills burned with red leaves, and each gust of wind turned the maples into a sea of sighs. David Rowe watched the landscape through the car window, his fingers drumming absently against the steering wheel. He was here for business, just another project survey in a small town called Maple Hollow, a name he'd skimmed over a dozen times without care. The driver slowed at an intersection near the town's elementary school, where David was supposed to meet a local representative. He looked up. The school gate, painted white, was framed by bursts of pink bougainvillea. Children spilled out laughing, their voices bright and careless, echoing through the afternoon air. The scene was so peaceful, so foreign to the rhythm of the life he knew, that for a brief moment he simply stared. Then he saw her, a woman, brown hair tied back, a gray coat, simple and unassuming. She knelt down, tying a little girl's shoelaces with slow, careful hands movements, tender and familiar. Just a moment, nothing more. But David's heart stopped. Clara. He could not be mistaken. 5 years, and yet time hadn't erased the curve of her neck, the way she leaned forward. Always gentle, always grounding the world around her into stillness. She straightened, taking the child's hand. The little girl looked up, smiling wide. That smile hit David like a collapsing sky, because the child had his eyes, that same deep green, his mother's gentleness, reflected through his own gaze. David didn't even realize he wasn't breathing. The sounds of the world blurred the laughter, the cars, even the wind, all fading into a single suffocating silence. He watched as the two of them walked down the maple-lined road, the woman he once loved and the child he had never known existed. Clara opened the door of an old silver car, buckled the girl in, kissed her forehead softly, then moved to the driver's side. That small gesture, a kiss, a touch, stabbed through him so sharply he had to grip the seat to steady himself. He stayed there watching until the car turned and disappeared behind the curve of the road. Only when the driver's voice broke through did he realize he hadn't drawn a breath. "Mr. Rowe, shall we go?" David didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the place where the car had vanished. It felt as though someone had peeled open the life he'd buried and left the wound exposed to the air. "Stay here a little longer," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. That night he didn't return to the luxury hotel his company had arranged. Instead, he checked into a small inn at the center of town. The room had only a wooden bed, a lamp, and a window overlooking the street. Outside, mist blanketed the rooftops, soft and pale like memory. David sat at the small desk, staring at nothing. All afternoon, the image replayed in his mind. Clara's smile, the way her arms wrapped around the little girl, the kiss on her daughter's forehead. Her daughter. The word struck like thunder. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a name: Mason, the private investigator who had once handled a few personal matters for him. "Mason, I need you to find someone for me. Clara Bennett. She used to live in Boston. She's in Vermont now. As soon as possible." "Of course, David. Is everything all right?" "Yes," he said, though his voice trembled. "I just need to know that she's all right." That night, David didn't sleep. He sat by the window, eyes fixed on the fog curling around the street lamps. The town was silent enough that he could hear his own heartbeat, uneven, heavy, guilty. He thought about the early years of their marriage. The small apartment overlooking the Charles River. They had nothing but each other, and at the time, that had felt like enough. Then came his first big project. The praise, the articles, the meetings that turned into dinners, the dinners that turned into all-nighters. "Just a few more years," he told her. "Then I'll give you everything we dreamed of." Clara had smiled, touching his cheek. "I don't dream of those things, David. I dream of you being home." But he hadn't listened. He thought he was building a future for them, never realizing he was destroying the present. He missed dinners, missed mornings, missed the moments she waited in silence, until she stopped waiting altogether. And when she finally left, he hadn't even seen it coming. The next morning, Mason's report landed in his inbox. David's palms were damp as he opened it. Clara Bennett, age 32. Occupation, freelance illustrator. Residence, Maple Hollow, Vermont. Child, Ivy Rowe. Bennett, age 4. Father, not listed. He read the last line over and over. Ivy Rowe Bennett, age 4. Each word cut like a blade. 5 years ago, when he signed those divorce papers, Clara had already been pregnant. David sat motionless, heart pounding out of rhythm. Guilt rose in waves, swallowing him whole. He imagined her, alone, carrying his child, leaving Boston to start again from nothing. He imagined the night she gave birth with no one there to hold her hand. He closed the laptop, pressing a shaking hand to his eyes. And for the first time in years, David Rowe cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears falling onto the desk, silent, late, and useless. He understood now. The thing he'd been missing all along wasn't success or companionship. It was the two people he had lost, the woman he had loved, and the daughter he never knew existed. When night fell again, David drove. He followed the same road from the day before until he reached the bend where he had seen them last. No one was there now, only rows of maples, crimson leaves scattered like embers across the ground. The wind swept through, carrying a faint scent of lavender, the scent that used to linger on Clara's collar on mornings he'd rushed out the door. He stood there a long time, fists clenched, eyes fixed on the distant hills. Now he knew the silence he had chosen years ago had finally begun to speak. And tomorrow he would go to the house where Clara and Ivy lived. Tomorrow the past would meet the present. Morning settled over Vermont like a pale veil of breath. The sun was only a faint blur behind the maples, and the air carried that thin, early autumn chill that slipped through every crack and under every door. David Rowe drove slowly down a dirt road that wound along the hillside. His headlights cut through the fog until the shape of a small house appeared. A wooden cabin painted soft blue, its slanted roof draped with a bundle of dried lavender hanging from the porch beam. He stopped the car and just sat there. It was her house, the place he had never known about, the house that had sheltered every moment he'd missed. The nights Clara had sung her daughter to sleep, the winters she had lit a fire alone, the springs she had watched bloom without him. David's hands rested on the steering wheel, frozen. Part of him wanted to drive away, to keep his memories preserved, painful, but untarnished. But another part, deeper, stronger, refused. He needed to know. He needed to see them with his own eyes, not through a report, not as a ghost of words on a screen. He stepped out of the car. Each footfall felt like stepping into his own past. The scent of wet grass and faint wood smoke hung in the air. He walked up the narrow path to the porch, drew in a breath, and knocked. The sound was soft but final. Inside, Clara was sorting through a stack of sketches on the table. Ivy sat at the kitchen counter, coloring, humming a tune only 5-year-olds could invent. When the knock came, Clara froze. It was unfamiliar, yet something in her chest tightened as if her heart remembered before her mind did. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. When she opened it, the world seemed to stop. There he was. David stood, framed in the mist, taller than she remembered, a few new lines around his eyes, the weight of years pressing into the curve of his shoulders. No suit, no boardroom armor. Just a gray shirt, jeans, and a silence that said more than words ever could. Clara's hand gripped the edge of the door. Her face drained of color. "David!" Her voice cracked, half disbelief, half something else she didn't dare name. He looked at her for a long moment and then said quietly, "I know." 3 words, they hit her like lightning. Neither moved. Neither breathed. The lavender on the porch swayed slightly, brushing against the wood with a dry whisper. 5 years of distance collapsed between them in a single second, too heavy for words, too fragile to touch. "You shouldn't be here," Clara said finally, her voice trembling. "I had to come," he answered. "I had the right to know I have a child." Her chest rose sharply. "Right? You're talking about rights now?" "Yes," he said, steady but soft. "You can't take away my right to be her father." Her laugh broke halfway. "You already took away my right to have a family." David flinched. "Clara, you chose work over us. I was building a future for us. I didn't need a castle if it was empty inside." Her voice cracked open, not in anger, but in pain, raw, deep, long buried. David fell silent. Every word she threw was true, and there was no defense left in him. He met her eyes, his voice low, almost breaking. "I was wrong. But please, let me see her. Just once." Clara turned away, took a slow breath, steadying herself. "Not today." "Clara!" "Not today, David!" Her voice splintered on his name. She couldn't believe he was standing here on her porch, at the threshold of the home she'd built to protect her daughter from everything he represented. From inside, a small voice called out, "Mommy?" "Who's at the door?" Clara froze. So did David. That voice, his daughter's voice. It cut straight through the walls he had spent years building around himself. Clara turned, forcing her voice calm. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just someone asking for directions." "Can I say hi?" Ivy called again. "No need, honey," Clara said quickly, her voice trembling despite herself. David stood motionless, breath caught in his throat. 1 second. That was all it took. To imagine the mornings he had missed, the breakfast, the small shoes by the door, the laughter he'd never heard. 5 years. 5 years he hadn't known she existed. Clara put her hand on the door. "Please, David, go. Don't make this harder." He looked at her. In her eyes, once the place he called home, he saw fear and boundaries built from heartbreak. But beneath it all, something flickered, fragile, trembling, like a candle struggling against the wind. He spoke quietly. "I'm not leaving. Not yet. Tonight after she's asleep, we need to talk." Clara held her breath. Their eyes locked, two people who had gone too far to turn back, and yet were too close to let go. David stepped down from the porch. The wind stirred, scattering bits of lavender across the steps. He reached his car but didn't start it right away. Through the rearview mirror, he saw her still standing there, hand clutching the doorframe, her face pale against the fading light, as if she'd just seen a ghost. When his car finally disappeared down the road, Clara shut the door and leaned against it. Her heart pounded wildly. The house was silent except for Ivy's soft humming in the kitchen. She walked back slowly, forcing a smile. "It's all right, love. Just a stranger." But her hands were cold. Her voice shook. She sat at the table, watching Ivy color with complete innocence, her small lips pursed in concentration. Those green eyes so unmistakably his. Clara turned away, but the tears came anyway. 5 years. 5 years of surviving by forgetting, of bearing the truth like snow bearing the ground. And now in a single morning, it had all come undone. Outside, the wind moved through the lavender once more. A door had closed, but somewhere inside her, another had opened, a door she had sworn she'd never open again. Clara sat there as the daylight dimmed, the shadows creeping across the walls, her heartbeat echoing like the knock still ringing in her ears. She knew, when Ivy fell asleep tonight, the past would come knocking again, and this time she wouldn't be able to hide. The night in Vermont was so still that it felt as if the world had stopped breathing. A crescent moon hung low above the dark line of trees, and the golden light spilling from Clara's porch stretched thin into the fog, fragile, trembling, alive. That little house, bright by day, now felt like a sealed box holding the air of two hearts that hadn't yet learned how to rest. Ivy was asleep. The faint glow of her nightlight seeped through the crack beneath the door. Clara stood there for a long moment, listening to the rhythm of her daughter's breathing. Then she turned away, her pulse aflutter she couldn't steady. David was already waiting in the living room. He hadn't knocked again. He hadn't said a word. He simply sat there, hands clasped, coat folded neatly beside him, posture bowed not as a man in control, but as someone who had nowhere else left to be. When Clara entered, he lifted his head. No smile and no greeting. Just a look, two people standing amid the wreckage of a storm, unsure how to begin rebuilding what they had once set on fire. She sat across from him. Between them was a small wooden table and a pot of tea that neither touched. The air was thick with everything unsaid. David spoke first. "I didn't come to blame you." His voice was low, rough, each word sounding like it had to fight its way out. "I just need to understand. That day when we signed the papers, you already knew, didn't you? About the baby?" Clara's eyes didn't lift. "Yes." Her answer was almost a whisper. Silence stretched long, unbearable. The clock on the wall ticked softly, counting the seconds of a life they had already lost. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, quiet but heavy. Clara drew a breath, her hands tightening on her skirt. "Because by then, you weren't the man I used to know, David." He looked up, the shadows under his eyes deepening. "The day we signed the divorce papers," she said slowly, I sat across from you, the man who once said he'd love me forever, and I couldn't even meet your eyes. You didn't ask. You didn't say a word. You just signed. And when the door closed behind you, I knew everything was over." Her voice trembled. "That same morning, I found out I was pregnant. But you weren't there to hear it." Her throat tightened. "I was afraid that if I told you, you'd think I was trying to hold on to you. I was afraid of your pity. But more than anything, I was afraid of the coldness in your eyes that silence of yours could kill faster than goodbye." She looked up now, tears glinting in her lashes. "So I stayed silent. I kept the baby, not to punish you, but to keep the one thing that still felt pure between us." David closed his eyes. A single tear escaped, heavy, real. He hadn't thought he could cry anymore, but now there was no armor left to hide behind. "I let work eat my soul," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought I was building a future for us, but I was trading you for walls and numbers. The day I signed those papers, I told myself it was strength, but it was cowardice. I walked away from the only thing that ever made me human." Clara's tears fell silently. "And I let the pain eat away my faith," she whispered. "I built walls and called them freedom. But all I was doing was hiding." They fell into silence again, the kind that hurts, the kind that heals. No apology could reach that deep. Sometimes words are too small for the size of regret. All that was left was presence. Two people who had once lost each other, now sitting face to face, seeing themselves reflected in the other's eyes. Time passed slowly. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. From Ivy's room came the faint hum of her lullaby machine, soft as breath. David's voice came next, fragile, uncertain. "Are you happy?" Clara didn't answer right away. She turned toward the window where moonlight lay on the lavender vines. "I'm at peace," she said finally, "and sometimes lonely. But it's the kind of loneliness I chose." He nodded, his eyes softened, full of both ache and awe. "I envy that. I have everything, but no peace. I thought I'd learned how to live without you, but when I saw you two outside the school that day, I realized I hadn't learned anything at all." A faint smile touched her lips, small, sad, weightless as mist. "Life's strange, isn't it? You lost me to understand what love is, and I lost you to understand what living means." David lifted his gaze. The lamplight caught in his eyes, making them brighter, truer. He reached out halfway, then stopped. "I won't ask you to forgive me," he said, "but I have one request." She looked at him, silent. "Let me see her. Please, just once." The room went still again. Between the ticking clock and the thrum of two uneven heartbeats, the request hung in the air, cutting and mending all at once. Clara closed her eyes. Memories flooded back the night Ivy was born, the first cry, those green eyes opening in firelight, the years of raising her alone, nights of sickness, winters of silence, but also moments of pure, untouchable joy. She opened her eyes again. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "after school. You can meet her then." David bowed his head, hands clasped tight as if he were holding the most fragile gift in the world. "Thank you." There were no smiles, no promises. Only two people are sitting in a small wooden house beneath the trembling light of a single lamp. Outside, the wind whispered through the lavender. The candle on the table flickered but didn't go out. And in that warm, wordless silence, both of them understood. This was not an ending, nor quite forgiveness. It was a beginning, as delicate as a flame in the wind, but enough to warm two hearts that had been cold for far too long. Soul Stories fam, if you're watching on another channel, come home to us at Soul Stories, where tens of thousands of listeners and sharers come together. From that day on, David began coming to Vermont every weekend, not with the appearance of a CEO, no suit, no ringing phone, no tightly packed schedule. Just a man carrying a small bouquet and a box of clumsily baked cookies, the same hands that once signed million-dollar contracts now fumbling through ordinary things. At first, Ivy only watched him from afar. She had a habit of hiding behind her mother's skirt, her round green eyes curious yet cautious. David didn't rush. He simply knelt down to her height and said softly, "Hi, Ivy." "I'm David." The little girl blinked. Mr. David? Yes. Do you know how to bake cookies? He hesitated. I'm learning. That answer made her laugh a laugh so pure it melted every bit of distance between them. That was the beginning. In the days that followed, he truly learned. Together with Clara and Ivy in the small kitchen, he fumbled among flour, eggs, and bursts of laughter. Flour stuck to his hands, even to Ivy's hair, making the little girl laugh uncontrollably. Mr. David, your cookies are ugly. Yeah, but I have the best teacher, don't I? Clara stood nearby, watching them, her heart softening without her realizing it. Maybe this was the picture she had once dreamed of, a small home. Clumsy but warm. David learned how to listen to his daughter. He sat on the floor with her, reading fairy tales. Whenever they came across a difficult word, Ivy would snatch the book, read it completely wrong, and burst into laughter. He laughed too for the first time in years. A real laugh, not the kind perfect for a magazine photo. Ivy had hundreds of questions about butterflies, about the moon, about why her mother hated onions. And once she looked up at him with those clear eyes and asked, Mr. David, do you like butterflies? He laughed, caught off guard by the innocent logic. I do. Now I do. Why? Because I met you and you're just like a little butterfly. Ivy nodded thoughtfully, her eyes brightening. Then I'll teach you how to chase butterflies. And she did, dragging him into the garden, running through rows of pale lavender while their laughter rang like wind chimes. Clara watched from a distance. David, the man who once lived only for numbers and power, was now chasing a 5-year-old girl around the garden, laughing so hard he had to brace his hands on his knees to catch his breath. In his hand was a toy butterfly net. In his hair, a pink clip Ivy had insisted he wear to look like a princess. Clara smiled softly. In that moment, she realized some people can only be redeemed when they learn how to kneel down beside a child. One mild afternoon, the three of them sat together on the porch. Ivy curled up in David's lap, eagerly talking about her drawing from school, while Clara arranged flowers in a glass jar, the golden light catching in her brown hair. The peace was so perfect that David was afraid to speak, afraid even his breath might break it. Then Ivy stopped, looked up at him, and asked quietly, Mr. David, can I call you Daddy? The question came as lightly as a breeze, but it shattered something deep inside him. He looked at her, unable to speak. No one had ever taught him how to respond when a child unknowingly handed him the most precious gift in life. His lips trembled. If you want to, he whispered, I'd be very happy. Ivy grinned, threw her little arms around his neck, and kissed his cheek. I love you, Daddy. David broke down, not with sound, but with tears hot, clear tears falling onto her soft hair. He held tightly to the daughter he had never carried as a newborn, never rocked to sleep, never heard call him father until now. Clara turned away, but tears still filled her eyes. She leaned against the doorway, one hand covering her mouth to keep from making a sound. In that image, David holding Ivy, the afternoon light tracing their faces, she saw the love that had once been shattered, slowly being pieced back together, fragment by fragile fragment. She remembered that night years ago, when she had just given birth, whispering through tears, It's just the two of us now, sweetheart. But now, maybe it wasn't just the two of them anymore. That embrace, those tears, they were fate's late reply. That evening, as David prepared to leave, Ivy ran to the door after him. Daddy, you'll come back next week, right? Daddy, just one word, and his heart tightened and bloomed all at once. He bent down, pressed his forehead gently against hers. I'll come every week. Ivy smiled, satisfied, and ran back inside. Clara stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching him. Thank you for coming. No, Clara, he said, his voice low. Thank you for letting me come back. Their eyes met not with anger, not with regret, but with the tenderness of two people who had once lost each other and were now learning how to walk the same path again. When David drove away from Maple Hollow, the road out of town was drenched in sunset. The wind carried the scent of lavender and the echo of a child's laughter somewhere in his mind. He didn't know what the future would bring. He didn't know if Clara would ever forgive him, but he knew this. From today, he had learned the first thing he'd never known before: how to be a father. Not by title, but by love. A love that was real, clumsy, but strong enough to begin again. In the weeks that followed, Vermont sank into the height of autumn. The maple trees lining the narrow road turned a blazing red, leaves drifting slowly onto the wooden porch and blanketing the yard. Clara's house seemed wrapped in the scent of lavender and freshly baked pies, and David, he still came, faithfully, like a new rhythm in the lives of mother and daughter. No promises, no demands, no attempt to fill a space that wasn't his. He simply was there. He shoveled the snow off the steps before dusk, fixed the squeaky window that rattled in the wind, replaced the burned-out bulb in the hallway. When Clara forgot lunch, he left a paper bag on her doorstep with a note: "Don't skip meals, you've got someone else who needs your strength." Clara read it and smiled. Not angry, not overwhelmed, just warm. Because after everything, he was no longer the man who came seeking forgiveness. He was a man quietly learning how to love the right way. By late October, the autumn fair arrived in the town square. Ivy had been talking about it for days, counting down to ride the carousel and eat cotton candy. Clara had planned to decline when David offered to take them, but the pure joy in her daughter's eyes made her say yes. They went together, no hand-holding, no closeness, but not distance either. Ivy bounced between them, her laughter like a thin thread stitching invisible rips back together. Clara noticed how David laughed when the little girl begged for one more carousel ride, and suddenly she saw. He was no longer the man who spoke only in deadlines, reports, and markets. He knelt to tie his daughter's shoelaces, wiped chocolate off her cheek, and listened intently as she talked about an imaginary butterfly named Luna. His patience startled her. It was almost tender. The next day, Margot dropped by. Over tea, she looked out the window, where David and Ivy were building a small wooden playhouse in the yard. "He's not the city wolf anymore, huh?" she teased. Clara smiled faintly, eyes still fixed on the porch. Maybe even wolves learn to fear losing their pack. That night, the wind rose, swirling yellow leaves through the air. Ivy was fast asleep, hugging her stuffed bear tight. Clara stepped onto the porch, a cup of steaming cocoa in hand. David stood by the railing, silent, the moonlight spreading silver over his shoulders. She stood there for a moment before speaking. "Thank you for being there for her." He didn't turn around. His voice was low, rough, like wind through pine. "I miss you." Just 3 words, not dramatic, not calculated, but enough to tear open the calm she'd fought months to keep. Clara looked at him for a long time. In those eyes, still the same shade as years ago, she saw fatigue, regret, and something she didn't dare name: the faint return of faith. "I miss you too," she said quietly, firmly. "But if coming back means reliving those lonely days again, then I can't." The wind swept past, rippling the cocoa in her cup. David gripped the railing tighter. He could have responded as he once would have, with logic, pride, the illusion of strength, but he didn't. He just nodded, slow and heavy. "I understand," he said, eyes fixed on the forest beyond. "I'm not asking you to come back. I'm asking for a chance to show you I can be different, not through words, but by the way I live." Clara stayed silent. Inside her, 2 forces collided, one part wanting to believe, the other trembling with fear. She was afraid of herself, afraid her cracked heart might soften again for the same man, afraid he would leave again, afraid to wake one night and hear nothing but the clock ticking in an empty room. "Sometimes," she whispered, "forgiveness doesn't mean opening the door." David turned to her, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. "I don't expect you to. I just need you to know I'm still standing outside, and I'll stay there as long as it takes." Clara lowered her gaze. For the first time in 6 years, she realized his voice no longer carried the tone of a man giving orders. It was the voice of someone who knew how to wait. A strong gust blew past, scattering dried lavender petals across the porch. They stood there, unmoving, listening to the wind in their own uneven breaths. Moonlight spilled across the railing, tracing their faces, 2 people who had once walked through love and ruin, now standing side by side, but still separated by a quiet, aching distance. Neither spoke again. Clara finally turned back inside and closed the door. The wooden hinge creaked softly, then fell silent. She leaned against it, still holding the now cold cup, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it in the stillness. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, leaves brushing against the roof. And David, he was still there, caught between shadow and moonlight. No one won, no one lost. There were only two people who once loved each other, learning how to stand face to face again, without breaking each other a second time. Winter arrived early, cold and luminous, as if Boston had been awakened under a thin sheet of glass. Christmas lights stretched down Beacon Hill Avenue, reflecting off the glittering surface of the Charles River. For David Rowe, this was the first winter in years that he didn't feel like the only man standing alone in the city. For weeks, he had been preparing for the 10th anniversary gala of Rowe Developments. But this time, it wasn't about success anymore. No pre-written speeches from assistants, no staged smiles for the press. He wanted this night to be something else, something real. One quiet afternoon in Vermont, he brought an envelope to Clara's house. She opened the door just as he stepped through the white fence covered in mist. Inside the silver envelope, the invitation read in elegant letters, Rowe Developments, 10th Anniversary Gala, Winter's Light. She skimmed it, her eyes lowering slightly. "You're inviting me?" "I'm inviting both of you," David said softly, his voice carrying something that sounded like a plea for re-entry. "Not to show off, Clara. I just want things to be seen for what they truly are." Clara hesitated. She hadn't forgotten what it felt like to be misplaced in his world, where everyone spoke in the language of ambition, money, and artificial smiles. She was ready to decline until Ivy ran out, her floral dress muddied at the hem, eyes wide with excitement. "Mommy, does Boston have snow yet? I've never seen a real ice castle before." Clara couldn't help but laugh, and maybe because of that light in her daughter's eyes, she said yes. The gala took place in mid-December at the Grand Marlowe Hotel, a ballroom of chandeliers and white orchids, the air thick with candlelight and murmurs. The glow from hundreds of candles made the space shimmer like a dream. When David entered, the room's chatter softened. He wore a black tuxedo, white shirt crisp, carrying the quiet grace of a man who had reached the top. But tonight, he wasn't looking for investors or photographers. He was waiting for someone. And then the doors opened. Clara appeared. A pearl-colored dress hugged her just right, simple but elegant. Her brown hair fell in soft waves, a few strands catching the chandelier's gentle light. Around her wrist was a thin silver bracelet, the only remnant of their old life. Beside her, Ivy wore a white dress and held a small bouquet of lavender, her green eyes clear as a Vermont morning. The room stilled. A few whispers rippled through the crowd. David didn't care. He walked forward, stopped before them, and extended his hand. "My two princesses finally here." Clara froze for a second, then placed her hand in his. In that moment, no one spoke. But both of them knew this was the first step toward walking side by side again, even if not yet hand in hand. When the soft music faded, David stepped onto the stage. The lights found him. The room held its breath, the kind of silence reserved for those used to seeing him as a symbol, not as a man. He smiled, his voice calm and steady. 10 years ago, Rowe Developments was just a small dream. A few of us worked from a rented apartment, believing we could build structures that would last. He paused. But it took me years to realize the strongest things we build aren't walls or steel. They're the people we stand beside. The light swept over the crowd, then stopped at the middle row. And tonight, I want to introduce the person who taught me that. This is Clara and my daughter, Ivy Rowe. Nothing more, nothing hidden. The words landed gently, but they rippled through the entire room. People turned, heads tilted, and then Ivy waved. A few guests chuckled softly. For a heartbeat, silence reigned, then applause began. Scattered at first, then swelling until the whole hall filled with it. It wasn't applause for a powerful CEO. It was for a man brave enough to stand in his own truth. Clara sat still, feeling something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not anger, not wariness, but a quiet peace. David stood there, in the light, no longer hiding, no longer pretending. She realized he wasn't trying to win her back. He was simply restoring the truth of what had been lost. She tilted her head slightly and smiled a small, knowing smile. "You've really changed," she thought. "Not in words, but in the way you stand without armor." After the speech, the music returned. David walked toward her again. A waltz? For old times and new beginnings? Clara almost refused, but Ivy nudged her gently. Go on, Mommy. I want to see you dance. She laughed, and as if paying back a debt to time, she placed her hand in his. They stepped onto the floor. The lights softened. The orchestra played slow, steady notes. It wasn't the dance of two people still in love. It was the dance of two people who had hurt each other and found the courage to meet again. David leaned closer, whispered, "Thank you for coming." Clara looked up, her eyes glistening beneath the chandelier light. "Thank you for not running anymore." When the night ended, they walked out together. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes drifting down like quiet memories, settling on their shoulders. Ivy ran ahead, laughing, hands outstretched to catch the snow. David and Clara stood side by side, watching her. No hands held, no words spoken. Just two people, standing still, watching the one thing that connected their past and their future dance beneath the lights. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe forgiveness is just another form of light. David turned to her, eyes gentle. And love, he said, is how we learn to keep that light, even through the dark. The first snow of the season fell softly over the wooden roof, covering the forest in a thin, breath-like veil. Inside the small house, the golden light from the lamp fell across Clara's face, tired, anxious, trying to stay calm. Ivy lay on the bed, cheeks flushed, breathing fast. The thermometer crept up to 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit. The town doctor said there was no need to rush to the hospital, just monitor and keep her cool. But watching her daughter twist weakly under the blanket, Clara felt her heart shatter. She called Margot then. Somehow, her trembling fingers dialed a different number. Or maybe her heart remembered exactly who it needed to be. "David? Clara?" His voice on the other end, groggy but instantly alert. "Ivy's burning up. I'm scared. I'm in Weston. 2 hours away. I'm coming. The roads are icy. Clara, I'm coming." 2 hours later, headlights cut through the falling snow. When the door swung open, cold air rushed in along with him. His coat was dusted white, hair damp, eyes shadowed, but his voice was calm, steady. "Where's our little one?" Clara pointed toward the bedroom. David moved quietly to the bedside. He placed a hand on Ivy's forehead, then went to warm some water, wet a cloth, and began to wipe her skin slowly, carefully. He didn't speak, didn't sigh, just did. Every gesture awkward but gentle, the kind of gentleness she thought had vanished with their marriage. Through the long night, when Ivy drifted in and out of fevered dreams, David told a story. His voice was hoarse but low, soothing. Once upon a time, there was a little fox who got lost in the winter woods. It walked and walked until it found a small wooden house with a light inside. Clara sat beside them, her eyes stinging. He wasn't just telling a story to their daughter, he was telling it to himself. At 3 in the morning, the fever still hadn't broken. David sat by the bed, replacing the damp cloth, humming a tune so faint it could have been a prayer. Clara watched him and realized this wasn't the man who had once walked away. This was someone learning to love again, not through words, but through presence. "You've changed," she whispered. "No," he said, eyes never leaving Ivy. "I just came back." 4 simple words, but they tore through 6 years of silence. Clara sat down beside him. Neither spoke again. Only the soft rhythm of breathing, the sound of water dripping from the cloth, and the flicker of firelight dancing on the walls. Outside, snow kept falling, but inside that little house, a different kind of warmth had begun to grow. At dawn, the fever eased. Ivy slept soundly, strands of damp hair sticking to her forehead. Clara tucked the blanket up to her chin, then turned to see David slumped in the chair, hands loose in his lap, utterly spent yet peaceful. For the first time in years, she saw him as fragile and beautiful in the way only those who've learned their limits can be. The first light slipped through the window. Ivy stirred, eyes fluttering open, green and clear as spring. "Daddy, Mommy," she murmured weakly, but smiling. "I dreamed we lived in a castle made of wood." Clara smiled, brushing her daughter's cheek. "That's your home, sweetheart." David opened his eyes, watching them bathed in morning light. Outside, the snow was melting slowly, droplets tapping gently from the eaves. In that moment, no one said a word. But all three knew that night had saved more than a child. It had saved them all from the cold of the past. That March, Vermont thawed early. The first buds of spring lavender began to peek through in the garden corner. Clara hung paper lanterns, Margot blew up balloons, and David was outside on the porch, struggling to tie a ribbon. "Daddy, that's crooked." "It's the wind, sweetheart." "Nope, you tied it wrong." David laughed, bending down to let her redo it herself. It was Ivy's 6th birthday and the first time she had both her parents preparing it together. The wooden table was draped in a white cloth, topped with a castle-shaped cake, silver candles, and dozens of drawings Ivy had made herself. Margot and Samuel were the only guests, but their laughter filled the little house like an orchestra. When they sang Happy Birthday, Clara felt her heart tremble, not from emotion, but from the quiet realization that this was what happiness felt like. No glamour, no grand gestures, just laughter, the scent of cake, and the gaze of a man who had once lost everything but had learned to treasure every second he was given. By afternoon, when everyone had left, the three of them sat on the floor amid scraps of wrapping paper and crumbs of frosting. Ivy yawned, hugging her new teddy bear. "I wish," she murmured sleepily, "that you and Daddy would get married again." The room went still. Clara froze, her pulse skipping. David didn't speak either. His eyes lingered on the messy curls of his daughter's hair. Clara tried to smile, though her voice was barely a whisper. "Why do you wish that, honey?" "Because then I could live with both of you," Ivy said, half asleep. "Not just when I'm sick and Daddy visits, but every day." Simple words, but they pierced right through the softest part of their hearts. David reached out, took Clara's hand. "I wish that too," he said quietly, as if afraid the sound itself might break the fragile peace. Clara looked at him for a long time. Her fingers trembled. "I'm scared, David. If we fall again, there might be nothing left to fix." He tightened his grip, eyes steady, unflinching. "Real love isn't about never falling," he said. "It's about choosing to get back up together." Clara laughed through her tears. In that moment, she didn't know if she was crying from joy or fear, only that her heart was finally opening, for the first time in 6 years. They were married a month later, right there in the garden. No white gown, no orchestra, no rows of guests, just Margot and Samuel, and Ivy in her tiny white dress, holding a lavender bouquet, taking her role as officiant far too seriously. A hand-painted sign hung from the wooden gate, written in Ivy's uneven letters. "Welcome to our new family." Clara wore a pale blue dress, her hair pinned with little white blossoms, her lips brushed with soft pink. David couldn't take his eyes off her. She was no longer the girl from 10 years ago. She was the woman who had walked through storms and now stood, knowing exactly what she would hold on to and what she would let go. Margot served as witness. Samuel filmed the ceremony, and Ivy stood in the middle, solemn as a little priest. David spoke first, voice low but certain. "I promise to choose you every day, even when you can't believe in me." Clara's voice shook, but her smile held steady. "And I promise to believe in us, even when the world tests us." No diamond rings, just 2 simple silver bands engraved inside with 3 words, "Our second dawn." When David leaned down to kiss her, Ivy clapped her hands and shouted, "Now I get to live in the wooden castle forever?" Everyone laughed, and their laughter rose into the clear air where the late afternoon sun poured through the lavender leaves. That night, after Ivy had fallen asleep, they stood together on the porch. Spring rain began to fall soft, light, almost like breathing. David wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close, the warmth of him sinking into her skin like a promise. "I used to think love died in the rain," Clara murmured, voice blending with the quiet patter. "But maybe it was just waiting for the sky to clear." David kissed her hair. "And I won't let it rain forever again." Inside, the glow from the fireplace spilled out onto the porch, golden, gentle. From within, Ivy's sleepy giggle echoed faintly, a tiny sound, but enough to fill the whole night. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes. She no longer measured time by the years lost, but by moments like this, where love didn't need to be perfect, only real enough to outlast the storms. Outside, the wind stirred the lavender. Inside, a family had been rewritten by the hands of those who had finally learned how to love again.